We're coming to the end of 2022, and it's an interesting year in Dublin Fire Brigade history because it marks an anniversary that's often forgotten about, often overlooked. It's the 300th anniversary of the coming of professional fire brigades to Dublin. Since 1711, the city had purchased fire engines for its own fire protection. They hadn't set up a fire brigade. They'd simply bought the engines and gave the use of them to a private individual who was supposed to bring them along to fires, round up some people who could use them, and deal with fires in the city. Very, very bad system because there was no training, there was no kind of uniformity in the standards of the people who were involved. In England, the situation had begun to change. After the Great Fire in London in 1666, huge amounts of property were lost. Rich people became poor, and rich people don't like becoming poor. So they looked into a system to deal with major fires, major disasters in built-up areas. And the idea that they had was fire insurance, which was a new concept at the time. There was insurance for ships and shipping, but fire insurance on individual dwellings was a new concept. The idea was that you would go to a company, they'd inspect your house, they'd set a value, you'd agree a value on it, and then you'd pay a premium, an annual premium to the company. And in the event of your house burning down, the company would pay the value of the house, the property and the goods to you. That was a good system, but it couldn't work with the existing parish fire engines and the kind of make up as you go along system that they operated on. Just people being rounded up and bringing the parish pumps along. Some would know how to use them, most wouldn't. So the insurance companies decided that it was in their best interest to set up fire brigades and to train firemen to actually use the engines and to become proficient at their trade. And by doing that, to save the company money in the long run. The first of them in London, the first really successful one, was a company called A Hand in Hand. There was a bit of doggerel at the time that was the hand in hand the race began. Then came the Phoenix and the Sun, the Exchange where old insurers run, the Eagle where the new. Other companies began to see this as a potentially profitable business and to get into the business. It largely was London based and then began to extend into the British provincial cities. And it was as late as 1722 when the first British company decided to expand into the Irish market. And the company that did that was the Royal Exchange Assurance, the REA. Now, the REA set up an agency here in Dublin. They appointed an agent, and they set up what was called at those times a fire engine establishment, its own company, Fire Brigade. One of the things about the company Fire Brigades was that at the time people were largely illiterate. So imagery was a huge part of the fire insurance business. Imagery in the form of fire marks, imagery in the form of colourful uniforms, imagery in the form of getting people's attention and demonstrating that this fire insurance company was different from that insurance company or that insurance company. I have here a picture of a Royal Exchange fireman in the uniform that would have been worn when they came to Dublin first. As you look at it, you realise that it's the most impractical uniform for fighting fires. The white knee breeches wouldn't be a huge kind of addition to anybody, along with the small shoes, and the top hat was more for appearance than protection. But for many years, that was the uniform. It has elements that would carry on right through the insurance period. Each fireman carried a badge to show not alone which company it was from, but where he stood in the hierarchy of that company. And we have one here with a possible provenance to Dublin for the Sun Insurance Company. Now, this is a Sun Insurance Company fireman's mark for badge number 12. And to this day, firefighters in Dublin Fire Brigade and most fire brigades carry a badge number. And it's still, I suppose, its origins link us back to the insurance fire brigades, and they're literally badge numbers. This would be worn on the sleeve of the uniform or occasionally on the leather strap worn on the uniform or on other clothes. The other implements that they brought, they began to professionalise the fire service. They began to look at the equipment that was used and either adopt tools from other trades for it or develop tools within the trades. One of the basic things, and you see it on the REA fireman, is an axe. And again, standard part of firefighters' equipment to this day. In the 18th century, the axe used was one like this. This is a boarding axe. It's the same pattern as was used by the Royal Navy at the time. This would have been very familiar to anybody in Nelson's Navy and in those years. It was a tool that was used on board ship, partly as a tool, but would also be used in the event of fighting and close quarter fighting on ships. If one ship was attempting to take another at close quarters, this was the preferred weapon. But it also carried a number of really useful features in firefighting. It could be used to cut through materials, it could be used to make holes in materials, or to give a fireman a grip on material that needed to be pulled, or even to prevent him from falling. So that is still very recognisable in modern firemen's axes, but this particular one, as I say, is an 18th century, early 19th century piece. The other thing that they began to think about in terms of protection for the firemen was helmets. As you can see, the initially beaver hats, the top hats would have been worn. Now, they would have been waterproof. They would have had a very, very small protection against falling slates or falling bricks. But very soon they began to develop the idea of an actual fireman's helmet. And this would have been one of the very first fireman's helmets. It's an 18th century piece again. This one is very similar to the type used, and quite possibly is one of the ones used by the Sun Insurance Company in their provincial branches, which would have been places like Dublin. The interior would have been stuffed with horsehair, and there would have been a leather flap at the back to prevent sparks or hot water or melting lead from going down the back of a fireman's uniform. So that's probably the earliest fire helmet in the country. The companies liked to have their emblems on any items that they used, even to the extent of fire bucket, like here, this one here, the REA 1720. That particular bucket, although it's dated 1720, that's more to do with the date that the company was founded. The bucket is a riveted leather construction, which would be late 18th century. An earlier bucket would be this type here, which would be hand sewn, but again, a fire bucket as used at that period. They marked the houses that were insured. Again, symbolism was very important. There's no point putting a sign on a house to say this house is insured by the Sun Insurance Company, or this house is insured by the Royal Exchange Insurance Company, because by and large people couldn't read. So you adopted symbols, and those symbols became synonymous with your company. In the case of the REA, it was the actual Royal Exchange. This is a later REA. Later on, we showed some early versions. It actually has an image of the Royal Exchange. These, initially, when they were put up, although these ones, the lead ones, tend to discolour back to a kind of a natural, neutral grey. They would have been quite colourful. The remains of the gilt, which would have been on the Royal Exchange, and the red background can be seen on this one. That's from about 1810. We have another one here, an early Sun mark. And again, very much using the imagery of the Sun. The Sun were one of the bigger companies. The Sun still exists in modified form to this day. And that imagery, that sunburst, is still part of their market. This particular mark, the details are on the back of it. It was issued in 1799 for the premises, for a named premises. And it carries the insurance number on the front, the policy number. It means that when a house, this is in the time before the postal system and the number of houses. So the house wasn't insured, property wasn't insured until a fire marks was affixed to it, because that meant that it was that particular house that was insured. So in the early days, it was very, very important to have a fire mark there. If a fire started, people would see it and would send for that company's fire brigade. Initially, the companies would only deal with premises that they insured, and as such were customers and were entitled to the use of the company fire brigade. But over time, they fairly quickly began to deal with any insured property and then claim it back among themselves, claim it back from the other company. They'd also, again, as time developed, they would fight basically any fire in the area if there was no other call in the time. But insured property always had priority. Insurance companies insured property. Their firemen were there to protect the company's property.